In the heart of North Carolina's ancient mountains stands a palace that should never have existed. 6 acres of floor space, 250 rooms, 65 fireplaces, an indoor swimming pool, a bowling alley, and a library containing 23,000 hand-selected volumes. All of it built by one man in the space of just 6 years in the 1890s. The cost adjusted for inflation, approaches $500 million today. It is the largest privately owned house ever constructed in the United States. And for decades, it was the personal playground of a single branch of America's most legendary Gilded Age dynasty. Yet today, entire wings of Biltmore House remain sealed to the public corridors that once echoed with the laughter of Astors and Morgans now gather, dust behind locked doors. And the once Vanderbilt fortune that created this monument has almost entirely vanished into history. This is the dark story of how the greatest fortune ever accumulated by an American family rose to unimaginable heights, built dreaming stone that still defies gravity, and then within 2 generations collapsed so completely that the family was forced to sell off the very silverware, the paintings, the tapestries, and finally, the house itself, just to survive. This is the story of Biltmore's abandoned wings, of heirs who inherited palaces, but not the means to keep them, and of a legacy that became both a treasure and a curse. To understand how a single family could lose everything after possessing so much, we must begin not in the mountains of Ash, but on a windswept dock in Staten Island in the year 1812, where a poor Dutch farmer's son named Cornelius Vanderbilt, nicknamed the Commodore, began ferrying vegetables to Manhattan in a tiny sailboat called a... By the time he died in 1877, Cornelius had transformed himself into the richest man in America, worth an estimated $105 million at a time when the entire federal budget was less than $400 million. When his fortunes is adjusted for inflation and expressed as a percentage of the nation's GDP, historians calculate that Cornelius Vanderbilt was wealthier than John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, or even modern titans such as Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk. His money came first from steamboats that slashed travel time between New York and Boston, then from the railroads that stitched the continent together after the Civil War. He was ruthless, brilliant, and utterly without sentiment. When competitors tried to block him, he simply lowered fares until they bled money, then bought their ruined companies for pennies. His own son, William Henry Vanderbilt, once asked him why he worked so relentlessly in old age. The Commodore replied, "I'm making money for my grandchildren's grandchildren." Yet within 70 years of his death, almost none of that money remained in Vanderbilt hands. The turning point came with Cornelius's grandson, George Washington Vanderbilt, to quiet, bookish, and painfully shy, the exact opposite of his swaggering grandfather. While his brothers Frederick and Cornelius II built marble chateaux on Fifth Avenue and Newport's cliffs, George turned his gaze southward. In 1888, at the age of 26, he took a train journey with his mother through the flood-ravaged mountains of western North Carolina. The air was clean, the views endless, and the land astonishingly cheap. After decades of overlogging and erosion, George purchased 125,000 acres, an area larger than the island of Manhattan, and announced he would build there a country place modeled on the great chateau of the Loire Valley. His architect would be Richard Morris Hunt, designer of the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Forcade and the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty. His landscape architect would be Frederick Law Olmsted, the genius behind Central Park. Together they would create not merely a house, but an entire self-sufficient estate complete with dairy farms, forests managed on scientific principles, brick kilns, 3 separate rail lines, and an entire village for the workers. Construction began on Christmas Eve 1889, and for the next 6 years, more than 1,000 men labored around the clock, many of them living in temporary shanties on the mountainside, while limestone blocks were hauled up newly built roads by mule teams, straining against the incline. When Biltmore House finally opened its doors on Christmas Eve 1895, it was the most technologically advanced private residence on Earth. Electric lights designed by Thomas Edison's company glowed in every room. 2 elevators whisked guests between floors, a fire alarm system ran throughout the walls, an indoor swimming pool with underwater electric lighting shimmered beneath a vaulted ceiling, and the refrigeration plant could produce 40 tons of ice per day. The banquet hall stretched 72 feet long beneath a 70-foot-high ceiling painted with scenes from medieval chivalry. George's personal library held 23,000 volumes, including first editions of Dickens and Audubon folios, bound in Moroccan leather. In the basement, a bowling alley and gymnasium awaited guests who preferred sport to literature. The cost was staggering: $5 million for the house alone, and $1,895, roughly $180 million today, and another $4 million for furnishings, art, and landscaping. George paid for everything in cash, drawing checks against an inheritance that had grown to approximately $60 million from his father's estate. At the housewarming party in 1895, guests arrived by private rail car and were greeted by liveried footmen while Richard Strauss's orchestra played in the Winter Garden. It seemed the Vanderbilt fortune was not merely secure, it was invincible. Yet even as champagne flowed through Biltmore's marble halls, invisible cracks were already forming in the foundation of the dynasty. Joris Vanderbilt, for all his taste and refinement, had no head for business. He poured millions into philanthropic forestry projects that would not turn a profit for generations, spent lavishly on rare books and Napoleonic tapestries, and maintained a staff of nearly 90 servants at Biltmore alone. His older brothers were little better. Cornelius II died in 1899 after a series of strokes, leaving his widow, Alice Gwynne Vanderbilt, to struggle with death taxes that forced the family to begin selling art as early as 1905. William Kissam Vanderbilt, builder of Marble House in Newport, divorced his wife Alva in a scandal that cost him millions and left him bitter and reclusive. The federal government, meanwhile, had begun to take notice of the colossal fortunes accumulated by a handful of men. In 1916, just 21 years after Biltmore opened, Congress passed the modern estate tax legislation that would eventually reach 77% on the largest inheritances. The Vanderbilts, who had built their empire in an era of almost no taxation, were suddenly confronted with bills that consumed half or more of every fortune when its owner died. George Washington Vanderbilt himself would not live to witness the full catastrophe. On March 6, 1914, at the age of 51, he underwent an emergency appendectomy in Washington, D.C. Complications set in peritonitis developed, and within days, the man who owned a kingdom in the mountains was dead. His widow, Edith, only 39 years old, was left with their 10-year-old daughter, Cornelia, a mountain of debts, and an estate that required $300,000 per year just to keep the lights on, an expense that consumed almost the entirety of the income from George's remaining investments. For the first time in its history, Biltmore House teetered on the edge of ruin. When George Washington Vanderbilt died in the spring of 1914, the mountain palace he had built for eternity suddenly became a beautiful white elephant. Edith Stuyvesant, dressed Vanderbilt, the reserved, steel-wheeled woman who had stood beside him since their wedding in Paris in 1898, now faced the impossible arithmetic that would haunt every subsequent generation of the family. Biltmore's annual operating costs in $1,914 hovered near $300, the equivalent of roughly $9 million today, while the income from George's remaining trust funds and securities produced barely $200,000 in a good year. The forests George had so lovingly managed under Olmsted's scientific plan were still decades away from commercial maturity. The dairy herds, the prize-winning Jersey cattle, the vineyards, to brickworks, none of them generated meaningful profit, and looming over everything was the newly strengthened federal estate tax, which would eventually claim 40% of the remaining principal when Edith herself died. The house that had been conceived as the ultimate symbol of permanence was, within months of its master's death, already sliding toward insolvency. Edith's first act of survival was brutal but necessary. She closed the entire south wing, the sprawling bachelor S-wing that George had designed for his unmarried brothers and their male guests, complete with its own billiard room, smoking room, gun room, and 35 additional bedrooms. Overnight, more than 60 rooms were shuttered, their furniture draped in linen shrouds, their fireplaces sealed with plywood. Servants who had lived on the estate for decades were let go with small severance payments and train tickets back to New York or Philadelphia. The indoor swimming pool was drained for the first time since 1895. its tiled bottom echoing with the sound of dripping water and loneliness. The bowling alley pins were stacked in a corner and never again set upright during Edith's lifetime. What had been built as a living, breathing organism of luxury suddenly became a museum of its own, recent past, with vast sections simply abandoned to silence. Yet Edith was not merely trying to preserve a house. She was trying to preserve a way of life for her only child, 10-year-old Cornelia. In the summers of 1915 and 1916, mother and daughter retreated to the smaller, more manageable bachelorette apartment on the third floor, a cozy suite of rooms overlooking the where Cornelia could still play with her governess while the rest of the palace slept. Visitors who managed to obtain an invitation during those lean war years described a surreal atmosphere. Dinner served by a skeleton staff of 20 on gold Limoges china in a banquet hall built for 200, the echo of their footsteps, the loudest sound in the house. The Great War in Europe brought a brief, cruel reprieve. With transatlantic passenger shipping paralyzed, America's elite had nowhere to summer except at home. Newport and Bar Harbor overflowed. And suddenly Biltmore, remote, cool, and utterly private, became fashionable again. Edith reopened a portion of the main guest rooms in 1917 and 1918, hosting Secretary of the Treasury William Gibbs McAdoo and other Washington dignitaries who needed respite from wartime stress. But when the armistice came in November 1918, the wealthy Americans rushed back to Paris and the Riviera, and Biltmore's gates closed once more. By 1920, the estate was again hemorrhaging money. The 1921 agricultural depression crushed commodity prices. The dairy lost tens of thousands. The staff dwindled to fewer than 30. Cornelia, now 16, spent more time at her mother's Park Avenue apartment than in the echoing halls of the house her father had built for her future. Then, in the winter of 1924-25, came the decision that would both save Biltmore and forever alter its soul. Edith's friend, Chauncey Beadle, the estate superintendent and one of the few men who understood both forestry and finance, proposed a radical idea: open the house to the paying public. The suggestion horrified the remaining Vanderbilts in New York. To charge admission like a carnival was unthinkable for a family that still considered itself American royalty. But Edith had no choice. On April 1st, 1930, during the very depths of the Great Depression, Biltmore House opened its doors to tourists at 50 cents per adult. The first year brought 36,000 visitors, many of them local families who had never seen the inside of a millionaire's home. Revenue soared past $100,000 almost immediately. For the first time since George's death, the estate turned a modest profit. The south wing, however, remained sealed. The cost of heating and insuring those extra 60 rooms was still deemed too great, and so the abandoned corridors stayed dark, their windows shuttered with plywood, while strangers in cloth coats shuffled past the banquet hall and winter garden on guided tours. Cornelia Vanderbilt, now a young woman of the Jazz Age, watched all of this with growing unease. In 1924, at the age of 23, she had married a charming but penniless British diplomat named John Francis Amherst Cecil in one of the last great society weddings ever held at Biltmore. The ceremony took place in the library, beneath the great Chagall-like ceiling painted by Pellegrini, and the reception spilled across the esplanade where 2,000 guests drank champagne beneath Japanese lanterns. But the marriage quickly soured. The Cecils expected their brides to live in England. Cornelia could not imagine abandoning Biltmore. By 1934, the couple divorced in Paris, and Cornelia returned to the estate with her two young sons, George Henry Vanderbilt, Cecil, and William Amherst. Vanderbilt Cecil? She moved into the sealed bachelor S-wing, the very rooms her mother had closed 2 decades earlier, and began the long, slow process of bringing them back to life, one fireplace at a time. By the late 1930s, the contradiction at the heart of Biltmore had become permanent. It was both a private home and a public monument, a living estate and a mausoleum, a profit-making enterprise and a money-devouring relic. Cornelia Vanderbilt Cecil, now the de facto mistress of the house, lived with her 2 small boys in the formerly abandoned bachelor S-wing, while thousands of strangers trooped daily through the main floors below. The revenue from tickets kept the roof patched, and the taxes paid, but every new expense repointing miles of stonework, replacing the original. Slate roof laid by Welsh craftsmen in 1894, battling an endless war against mountain damp that rotted silk wall coverings and warped priceless. Parquet devoured the surplus almost as quickly as it appeared. Cornelia's sons, George Henry and William M., grew up chasing each other through corridors that were simultaneously their playground and a museum exhibit. They learned to recognize the sound of the 10 a.m. tour group ascending the staircase and would hide behind suits of armor, until the guide-esque voice faded toward the library. Terre, still only in her 30s, aged visibly under the strain. In private letters, she confessed that she sometimes, late at night, she walked the empty banquet hall alone and wondered whether her father had built a palace or a prison. The Second World War brought another reprieve, though a darker one. With gasoline rationing and overseas travel impossible, Americans once again turned inward, and visitor numbers at Biltmore doubled. The estate's dairy supplied milk to the war effort. The forests were selectively logged for military crates. Cornelia even allowed the Coast Guard to use part of the grounds for training exercises. Yet, when peace returned in the pattern repeated itself. The wealthy resumed their European summers. The middle class bought television sets instead of train tickets to Asheville, and attendance fell by nearly 40%. By 1950, the estate was once again losing money. The south wing, the bachelor's wing that Cornelia had briefly reopened, was closed for the second time in its history. The bowling alley, the gun room, the smoking room with its leather-paneled walls and bronze humidor, commissioned from Tiffany, all were sealed again. The indoor swimming pool, refilled briefly in the 1940s for the boys to learn to swim, was drained once more and never refilled in Cornelia's lifetime. The cost of chlorine alone had become prohibitive. Cornelia's marriage to John Cecil had ended in divorce, but the financial entanglement did not. Under British law, Cecil retained certain rights to income derived from the Biltmore estate because the original marriage settlement had been drafted. Carelessly. For years he drew an annual allowance that further bled the estate's fragile cash flow. In 1954, exhausted by lawsuits and sleepless nights over unpaid bills, Cornelia made the decision that no Vanderbilt before her had ever seriously contemplated. She began quiet negotiations to sell Biltmore outright. Potential buyers circled hotels, chains, religious organizations, even the state of North Carolina. But every offer came with the same condition: the house would become a public institution, and the family would leave forever. Cornelia could not bring herself to sign. Instead, in a last act of defiance, she turned day-to-day management over to her elder son, George Henry Vanderbilt, Cecil, then 27 years old, and retreated to England with her second and third husbands in rapid succession. She would never again live full-time at Biltmore. George Cecil and his younger brother, William Amherst, known to everyone as Bill, were the first Vanderbilts in history raised not as princes, but as caretakers of a crumbling inheritance. They had spent their childhood watching their mother count pennies. They understood numbers in a way their great-grandfather George Washington Vanderbilt never had. In 1956, with the estate facing yet another liquidity crisis, the brothers incorporated the Biltmore Company, transferring legal ownership of the house and remaining 8,000 acres from the family trust into a for-profit corporation in which they and their descendants would be shareholders. The move was revolutionary. For the first time, Biltmore would be run not as a private residence but as a modern business. Ticket prices were raised. A gift shop was installed in the former stables. The old Biltmore Dairy was spun off into a separate corporation, eventually becoming Biltmore Dairy Farms, famous for its ice cream. Most controversially, the brothers began selling off the remaining collections that had survived wars, depressions, and death taxes. Minor Impressionist paintings, Chinese porcelains, Renaissance tapestries, Ibn Napoleones, Chesset from St. Helena, the auctions at Park Burnett and Sotheby's in the late 1950s and early 1960s were dignified but heartbreaking. Each sale paid another year of taxes, another repaired roof turret, another restored marble balcony. Yet even these sacrifices were not enough. By the mid-1960s, the bachelor's wing had been closed for 15 years. Water had seeped through neglected skylights. Plaster had fallen in chunks the size of tabletops. Pigeons nested in the rafters of the gun room. The cost to restore those 60 abandoned rooms was estimated at more than the entire annual operating budget of the public areas. The brothers made the calculation that every Vanderbilt before them had refused to make. Some parts of Biltmore would have to remain lost forever. In 1968, the wing was permanently sealed at both ends with cinder block walls disguised behind false bookcases. The original oak doors were removed and stored in the sub-basement. Electrical wiring was cut, plumbing capped, windows boarded from the inside. What had been built as the most lavish guest suite in America became, in effect, a time capsule of Gilded Age, untouched and decaying in darkness. By the 1970s, the name Vanderbilt had become little more than a brand, a ghost stitched onto postcards and souvenir ashtrays sold in the old stables. The fortune that Cornelius the Commodore had spent a lifetime amount, that George Washington Vanderbilt had poured into limestone and marble, had effectively disappeared. What remained was the house itself, 8,000 acres of mountain land, and two young men in their 40s, George and Bill Cecil, who understood that their inheritance was no longer money but a liability measured in millions of dollars per year. They had watched their mother flee to Europe rather than witness the final dismantling of her childhood home. They had grown up hearing servants whisper that the house was cursed, that every time another wing was closed or another painting sold. Yet they refused to let it die. Instead, they did what no Vanderbilt before them had ever truly mastered. They adapted. In 1971, Bill Cecil, William Amherst, Vanderbilt Cecil, the younger brother with the easy smile and the sharper business instincts, took over day-to-day control of the Biltmore Company, while George retreated to manage the forestry operations. Bill had married Mary Lee Ryan, a bright, no-nonsense Washingtonian, in 1957, and together they moved into a modest brick house on the estate that had once been the head gardener's cottage. From that, unassuming rooms overlooking the Deer Park, they began the slow transformation of Biltmore from aristocratic folly into America's first heritage tourism empire. Ticket prices rose again. A second, larger gift shop was built. The former laundry building was converted into the Biltmore Winery in 1976, using grapes planted decades earlier by George Washington Vanderbilt himself. The first vintage, a rather thin Riesling, sold out immediately to tourists who wanted to drink something grown on Vanderbilt soil. By 1985, the winery was producing 80,000 cases a year and had become the most visited winery in the United States. The abandoned dairy barns were turned into restaurants. The old stable courtyards became Christmas shops. Every square foot that could generate revenue was pressed into service, while the sealed bachelor's wing remained untouched behind its cinder block walls, a silent reminder of what had been sacrificed to keep the rest alive. The turning point came in 1995, on the centennial of the house's completion. Bill Cecil's son, William Avi Cecil Jr., known as Bill Jr., now in his 30s, proposed something that would have been unthinkable to earlier generations: build a luxury hotel on the estate. The family still owned hundreds of acres of undeveloped hillside with panoramic views of the palace. In 2001, the Inn on Biltmore Estate opened 210 rooms of 4-star elegance charging rates that finally reflected the grandeur guests had only previously glimpsed on a 1-hour tour. Overnight, Biltmore's annual revenue tripled. Antler Hill Village followed restaurants, more shops, a second hotel, and suddenly the estate was generating cash flow its founders could never have imagined. The slate roof was completely replaced for the first time since 1895. The facade was cleaned of a century of mountain soot. The great Pellegrini ceiling in the library, flaking and blackened by decades earlier, was meticulously restored at a cost of $5 million. For the first time in living memory, Biltmore was not merely surviving, it was thriving. Yet even in triumph, the abandoned wings remained abandoned. In the 1980s and again in the early 2000s, engineers conducted structural surveys of the Bachelor S-wing and delivered the same grim verdict. Decades of leaks and temperature fluctuation had caused irreversible damage to plasterwork parquet and the elaborate carved oak paneling imported from France. The cost to restore the 60 rooms to museum quality was estimated at $60 to $80 million, with no possibility of ever recouping the investment through ticket sales because the narrow corridors and low ceilings could never accommodate modern tour groups safely. The family made the irreversible decision. The wing would stay sealed. In 2015, During routine maintenance, workers removed a false bookcase and opened one of the original oak doors for the first time in 47 years. Inside, they found a perfectly preserved 1895 time capsule, cigar ash. Still in the ashtrays, billiard balls racked on the green felt table, a copy of the New York Times, dated August 12, 1914. The day World War I widened, lying folded on a sideboard. The air was cold and smelled of cedar and decay. They closed the door again and reinstalled the cinder blocks. Some losses, the Cecils decided, are permanent. Today, Biltmore welcomes more than 1.4 million visitors a year. More than Graceland, Monticello, and Hearst Castle combined. The winery alone generates tens of millions in profit. The Cecil family, still the sole shareholders of the privately held Biltmore Company, are wealthy again. Though their fortune is measured in the low hundreds of millions rather than the tens of billions their ancestors once commanded, they live quietly on the estate, drive pickup trucks, and personally greet employees by name. Bill Cecil Sr. died in 2017 at the age of 8, having spent the last 60 years of his life ensuring that his great-grandfather's dream did not vanish entirely. His children and grandchildren continue the work. The house is safe, the gardens immaculate, the gardens more beautiful than they have ever been. But if you visit on a quiet weekday in early spring, before the tour buses arrive, you can still walk along the South Terrace and notice the brick-top windows high above the wisteria. You can stand beneath them and listen. On certain still mornings, employees say you can hear faint echoes drifting. Down from the abandoned floors, the click of billiard balls, the murmur of long-dead voices, the ghost of a fortune that was never quite large enough to outrun time itself. 130 years after the first stone was laid, Biltmore House stands not as the private palace. George Washington Vanderbilt imagined, but as something stranger and in its own way more enduring. The last surviving intact monument of the American Gilded Age, rescued from ruin by the very forces that destroyed every other Vanderbilt palace. The Breakers survives in Newport, but only as a museum emptied of its family. Marble House, Hyde Park, the Elms, Idle Hour, Florham, all are either institutions or ghosts. Biltmore alone remains alive, owned and operated by the direct blood descendants of the man who built it, still turning a profit. Still growing grapes on the same hillsides George planted, still pouring the same mountain spring water into the same copper pipes installed in 1895. Fortune is gone, scattered by taxes, divorces, bad investments, and the simple mathematics of exponential maintenance costs. But the house endures, because the family finally learned the lesson their ancestors never grasped. A palace can only survive if it serves a purpose larger than the ego of one man. Stand on the library terrace at closing time, when the last visitors have been gently shepherded toward the parking lots, and you can feel the strange duality of the place. The public floors gleam with fresh wax and restored gilding, every chandelier sparkling, every tapestry vibrant. Yet 3 floors above your head, and stretching the entire length of the South Facade, 60 rooms rot quietly in the dark. The bachelor's wing is not haunted in any supernatural sense. There are no documented ghosts, no spectral footmen carrying silver trays, but it is haunted by absence. It is the physical embodiment of everything the Vanderbilt family lost. The carefree extravagance, the belief that money could be spent like water because the well would never run dry. The illusion that a single dynasty could remain on top of the American pyramid forever. Those rooms were closed the first time in 1914, reopened briefly in the 1920s, closed again in the 1950s, and sealed permanently in 1968. They have now been abandoned longer than they were ever occupied. In another century, the roofs will cave in, the oak paneling will powder to dust. And the last physical evidence that a Vanderbilt ever entertained guests with Cuban cigars and 100-year-old brandy will disappear forever. Yet that, perhaps, is the final irony of Biltmore's story. The house only survived because the family was willing to let part of it die. Every dollar spent restoring the abandoned wing would have been a dollar not spent saving the banquet hall, the library, the winter garden, the parts the public sees and loves. The Cecils made the same calculation. Edith Vanderbilt made in Cornelia in 1930, George and Bill in 1956. Sacrifice the unreachable rooms so the rest may live. They turned a private tragedy into a public triumph, and in doing so they broke the curse that consumed every other branch of the family. There are no more Vanderbilts on the Forbes 400. There has not been a Vanderbilt among the 100 rich Americans since the 1940s, but there is still a Vanderbilt, actually dozens of them, walking the gravel paths of Biltmore every morning, checking the vineyards, tasting the new vintage, making sure the gates open on time. The bloodline that once measured its worth in hundreds of millions now measures it in visitor satisfaction surveys and TripAdvisor reviews. And they are content. If you leave the estate by the south gate at dusk and drive up the winding service road that the tourists never see, you will pass a small, unmarked cemetery hidden beneath ancient cedars. There lie George Washington, Vanderbilt, and Edith, side by side in simple granite sarcophagus. Cornelia is buried in England, but her sons George Henry and William Amherst rest here too, beneath modest stones that give no hint of the empire they saved. The inscription on George chose for himself in 1914 is almost painfully understated. George Washington, Vanderbilt, 1862-1914, he made a beautiful thing he did. And then, against every odd that history could stack against it, to world wars, the Great Depression, estate taxes that devoured 3/4 of the original fortune, changing tastes, rising labor costs, the simple passage of time. His descendants kept it beautiful. The wings he built for guests who never came again are gone now, swallowed by darkness and brick. But the heart of the house beats stronger than it has in a century. The gardens bloom in the gardens he never lived to see mature. The forests he planted for a future he could not imagine now shade the grandchildren of the grandchildren he hoped would inherit them. The dark story of the Vanderbilt family's lost Biltmore fortune is, in the end, not a story of defeat. It is the story of how an American dynasty learned the hardest lesson any dynasty can learn, that immortality is not purchased with marble and gold, but earned generation after generation by people willing to let go of yesterday's dreams so tomorrow's visitors can walk through today's reality. The abandoned wings are the price that was paid. The open doors are the miracle that remains.